August 1996. The massive steel doors of the Detroit Arsenal tank plant ground open one last time. A single, solitary M1 Abrams tank rolled out into the Michigan sunlight. Then, the engines died. The deafening roar of machinery that had echoed relentlessly for 55 years finally fell silent. In an instant, an industrial fortress was shuttered, and thousands of workers were stripped of their livelihoods. This wasn't just any factory. At its absolute peak, this 113-acre behemoth was the very beating heart of the arsenal of democracy. It churned out an astounding 907 Sherman tanks every single month, supplying half of America's entire armored force during the Second World War. Over 5 decades, 44,000 colossal war machines were forged in its fires. Yet the sprawling complex that once stood as the salvation of the free world was reduced to absolute zero. The assembly lines are gone, the colossal cranes dismantled. How does an unstoppable industrial juggernaut, a facility that armed the Allies to defeat the Axis powers and stood as an immovable shield throughout the Cold War, simply cease to exist? How does it get abandoned, carved up, and erased by the very economic system it sacrificed everything to defend? The answer reveals a devastating truth about the American industrial machine. This is not just a story about armored vehicles or military contracts. The fall of the Detroit Arsenal exposes the brutal reality of a changing era, proving that sometimes the most catastrophic consequence of global peace is absolute industrial collapse. In the early spring of 1940, the world was bleeding, but the heartland of America remained deceptively quiet. Across the Atlantic, the mechanized terror of the German blitzkrieg was tearing through Western Europe, rewriting the rules of warfare with a brutal symphony of speed and armor. The French lines had shattered. The British were backed against the sea. Yet beneath the vast gray skies of Macomb County, Michigan, the land was still just land. Specifically, a sprawling 113-acre celery farm in Warren Township. It was a place of quiet soil, seasonal harvests, and freezing winds. No one looking at those frozen furrows could have imagined that they were about to become the anvil upon which the survival of the free world would be forged. At that time, the United States was officially neutral, but President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood the grim mathematics of the changing era. The American military was a relic of a bygone age. In 1940, the entire United States Army possessed barely 400 tanks, and most of them were hopelessly obsolete, thinly armored machines better suited for a museum than a modern battlefield. The military establishment, bound by tradition, still believed that weapons of war should be crafted slowly, meticulously, and exclusively in traditional government arsenals. Places like Rock Island, where craftsmen turned out artillery pieces one by one. But Roosevelt knew that artisanal craftsmanship could not defeat a global mechanized empire. He needed volume. He needed a miracle of scale. On May 16, 1940, the president stood before Congress and delivered an address that sent shockwaves through the nation. He demanded an impossible surge in industrial military output, calling for 50,000 airplanes a year and an unprecedented mobilization of heavy armor. To orchestrate this titanic shift, he established the National Defense Advisory Commission and tapped William S. Knudsen, the former president of General Motors, to bridge the gap between the Oval Office and the gritty reality of the assembly line. Knudsen was a man of the factory floor, an industrial titan who understood that mass production was not just a method, but a uniquely American superpower. He looked at the military's desperate need for tanks and realized immediately that the government arsenals could never meet the demand. They were scaled for peacetime. To build a mechanical beast that weighed 30 tons and required thousands of precision machine parts, the government needed the people who already knew how to build the modern world. They needed Detroit. In June 1940, Knudsen picked up the telephone and called K.T. Keller, the formidable, no-nonsense president of the Chrysler Corporation. The conversation that followed was brief, laced with the wry, pragmatic bravado of American industry. "K.T.," Knudsen asked, "can you build a tank?" Keller did not hesitate, though his company had never built anything heavier than a Plymouth sedan. "Yes," he replied. "Where can I see one?" That simple exchange birthed an entirely new paradigm of industrial warfare, the GOCO model, government-owned, contractor-operated. The traditional boundaries between the state and private enterprise dissolved in the face of existential necessity. The federal government would provide the capital, purchasing the land, and paying for the physical structure. But Chrysler would provide the brains, the muscle, and the ruthless efficiency of the automotive assembly line. They would design the factory, hire the men, engineer the tooling, and run the floor. It was a marriage of federal urgency and corporate ambition, a mythical pact forged in steel. But a pact is just paper. The reality was a logistical nightmare. Chrysler engineers traveled to the Rock Island Arsenal to study the blueprints of the M2A4 medium tank, a design they quickly realized was already outmatched by European armor, prompting a rapid pivot to a heavier 75mm gun, wielding behemoth that would become the M3. As the engineers frantically redesigned the machine for mass production, reducing complex riveted joints to simpler, sturdier welds, the physical factory had to be willed into existence. Enter Albert Kahn, Detroit's legendary architect of industry. Kahn was tasked with designing a structure that defied comprehension. The blueprints called for a building of staggering, almost mythical proportions, 5 city blocks long and 2 city blocks wide, encompassing over 1 million square feet of floor space under a single soaring roof. It was to be the largest manufacturing space the world had ever seen, a cathedral of industry dedicated to a singular, violent purpose. In the late autumn of 1940, the celery farm in Warren Township was torn apart. Steam shovels bit into the Michigan dirt, ripping up the roots of peacetime. And then the winter hit. It was a brutal, bone-chilling season. The ground froze solid, turning the earth into iron. But the clock was ticking, and the news from Europe was growing darker by the day. Construction could not stop for the weather. Men drove bulldozers through blinding snow squalls. Steel workers walked the high beams in sub-zero temperatures, their hands numb inside heavy leather gloves, welding the great steel skeleton of the plant while the wind howled off Lake St. Clair. To cure the concrete foundations in the freezing temperatures, workers built massive tents over the pouring sites and pumped in hot air from coal-fired steam engines. It was a feat of sheer, stubborn human will. They were building an airplane while flying it, designing the tank, engineering the complex machine tools required to cut its armor, and constructing the massive roof over their heads all at the exact same time. The pressure was suffocating. Every delay was measured, not in lost profits, but in the potential loss of American lives on battlefields that were drawing inevitably closer. By the spring of 1941, just months after the first shovel had broken the celery fields, the impossible had taken shape. Rising from the mud of Macomb County was a monstrous fortress of glass, steel, and brick. The Detroit Arsenal tank plant was ready to breathe. The quiet earth had been permanently conquered, replaced by the dormant, heavy silence of cold machinery waiting for the spark. The impossible demand had been met. Now, the giant simply needed to wake up. In the spring of 1941, the Detroit Arsenal tank plant was no longer a blueprint, nor was it a freezing construction site. It was a waking leviathan. On April 24th, months before the United States would officially enter the war, the factory doors rolled open and the first M3 tank, a lumbering, rivet-bound beast of steel, clattered out into the daylight. It was a monumental achievement of logistics and sheer willpower, but the men and women on the floor had no time to celebrate. The machine they had built was merely a prologue. When the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor in December of that same year, the illusion of American isolationism shattered overnight. The factory did not just need to operate, it needed to roar. The immediate and terrifying challenge was the scale of the impending global conflict. The Axis powers had spent years refining their mechanized doctrines and building their war machines. America was playing a desperate game of catch-up. To meet the insatiable demands of the War Department, the factory floor underwent a radical, unprecedented transformation. The traditional American workforce, predominantly young, white men, was rapidly draining away, drafted into the armed forces to fight the very war the factory was arming. In their place stepped a demographic revolution. Overnight, the population of the Detroit arsenal swelled to over 5,000 workers per shift, operating around the clock in a relentless, deafening rhythm of 24-hour production. Thousands of women, answering the patriotic call of Rosie the Riveter, stepped into grueling, heavy industry roles they had historically been barred from. They operated colossal overhead cranes, welded heavy armor plating, and managed complex machining tools. Alongside them worked thousands of African Americans who had migrated from the Jim Crow South seeking both better wages and a chance to strike a blow against global fascism. The factory floor became a chaotic, egalitarian crucible of grease, sweat, and shared purpose. The environment inside the plant was an assault on the senses. To walk down the central aisle of the Detroit arsenal was to walk through an artificial thunderstorm. The air was thick with the acrid scent of ozone from thousands of welding torches and the heavy metallic tang of machined steel. The noise was absolute and physical, a permanent bone-rattling cacophony of pneumatic hammers, grinding gears, and the guttural roar of massive radial engines being tested on the blocks. It was so loud that workers communicated through an intricate system of hand signals, their voices utterly useless against the mechanical thunder. By 1942, the clumsy M3 was phased out, making way for the M4 Sherman. The Sherman was Chrysler's masterpiece of mass production. It wasn't the most heavily armored tank in the world, nor did it boast the biggest gun, but it possessed something far more lethal: manufacturability. Chrysler's automotive engineers had meticulously designed the M4 so that it could be assembled using the same continuous flow logic that built Plymouth sedans. The assembly line at the arsenal was a marvel of synchronized chaos. A chassis would begin at one end of the massive building, a mere skeleton of steel. As it crawled down the line, an army of workers swarmed over it. Massive overhead cranes, gliding along the ceiling like steel spiders, dropped heavy transmissions and 30-ton turrets into place with millimeter precision. The tanks moved inexorably forward, growing heavier, deadlier, and more complete with every station. The pressure on the workers was agonizing. They were not simply building commercial goods, they were building survival. Every delay, every flawed weld, every rejected transmission meant a delay on the front lines in North Africa, Europe, or the Pacific. The workers knew the stakes intimately. Many had husbands, brothers, or sons fighting overseas. They knew that the men they loved might one day sit inside the exact hull they were currently riveting. This profound emotional burden fueled a blistering pace of production that defied logic. The climax of this industrial frenzy arrived in December 1942. The plant hit a production peak that stunned both American generals and Axis spies alike. In a single month, the Detroit Arsenal tank plant churned out an astonishing 907 Sherman tanks. That equated to roughly 30 tanks rolling off the line every single day, more than one massive war machine completed every single hour. It was a staggering mathematical reality that the factories of Germany and Japan, heavily reliant on skilled artisanal labor and increasingly battered by Allied bombing, simply could not comprehend, let alone match. The Detroit Arsenal had become the undisputed heart of the arsenal of democracy. It was a singular point on the map where American industrial might translated directly into armored divisions. By the time the guns fell silent in 1945, the plant had contributed a staggering percentage of the total American armored force. The men and women of Macomb County had successfully willed a river of steel into existence, fundamentally shifting the balance of global power. When World War II ended, a sudden, eerie quiet descended upon the massive complex. Contracts were slashed, the frantic 24/7 shifts were halted, and thousands of workers were sent home, their impossible task completed. For a brief, naive moment, it seemed the factory had fulfilled its destiny and might be allowed to rest. But the dawn of the nuclear age and the drawing of the Iron Curtain would soon prove that the world's appetite for war had not been extinguished. It had merely mutated. The giant would not be permitted to sleep for long. The silence that followed the surrender of Japan in September 1945 was heavy, almost unnatural, inside the Detroit Arsenal tank plant. The sprawling complex had fulfilled its impossible, bloody mandate. As military contracts evaporated overnight, the deafening roar of the assembly lines faded to a hollow echo. The workforce, once a bustling army of over 5,000 souls per shift, plummeted. For a fleeting, optimistic moment in American history, it seemed the great industrial fortress might simply fade into the background, a monument to a closed chapter of global violence. The nation was pivoting to a booming civilian economy, and the appetite for 30-ton weapons of war had seemingly vanished. But the illusion of a lasting, tranquil peace was violently shattered in June 1950. When the Cold War suddenly turned terrifyingly hot on the Korean Peninsula, the geopolitical landscape shifted overnight. The United States military, having rapidly demobilized, was caught completely off guard. The trusted Sherman tanks, the mass-produced heroes that had flooded the battlefields of Europe, were suddenly revealed to be obsolete, outgunned, and outmaneuvered by the heavily sloped armor of Soviet-supplied T-34s rolling south across the 38th parallel. The government realized with chilling clarity that an arsenal built to defeat the Axis was now desperately needed to contain the sprawling, aggressive reach of the Soviet Union. The giant in Warren, Michigan, had to be violently shaken awake once more. However, the rules of this new era of warfare had fundamentally changed. During World War II, the mandate was sheer, overwhelming volume. The factory had operated on the philosophy that quantity was a quality all its own. Now, as the shadow of the Cold War deepened and the nuclear threat loomed, the mandate shifted entirely toward technological supremacy. The Soviet Union was not just building tanks. They were engineering heavier, deadlier, and far more heavily armored machines. To survive the rugged terrain of Korea and prepare for a potential apocalyptic clash in the heart of Europe, the American military demanded a new breed of armor, the Patton series. The transition from the Sherman to the M46, M47, and eventually the M48 Patton tanks tore through the factory floor like an earthquake. These were entirely different beasts. They were significantly heavier, boasted wider tracks, and were armed with massive 90mm main guns that required specialized, highly precise handling. The continuous flow assembly line that Chrysler had so perfectly orchestrated in the 1940s was suddenly forced to accommodate a much more punishing and complex manufacturing process. The engineering tolerances were tighter. The cast steel was thicker and far more difficult to machine. The internal components, previously rudimentary and purely mechanical, were becoming increasingly sophisticated. The workers returned to the Macomb County facility, but the atmosphere inside the cavernous building had irrevocably shifted. The patriotic, unified fervor of the 1940s, driven by a clearly defined enemy and a definitive goal of absolute, unconditional victory, was replaced by a grim, enduring anxiety. The Cold War was not a sprint to Berlin or Tokyo. It was an exhausting, paranoid, and open-ended marathon. There was no timeline for when this new, shadowy conflict would end. The factory was no longer viewed as a temporary, desperate wartime measure. Instead, it had hardened into a permanent, pulsating engine of the American military-industrial complex. The relentless pressure to innovate technologically, while simultaneously maintaining mass production, began to place a silent, immense strain on both the human workforce and the physical infrastructure of the plant itself. By the time the 1960s arrived, the Cold War had settled into a terrifying, heavily armed stalemate. The Detroit Arsenal tank plant was now tasked with building the ultimate conventional deterrent, the M60 Patton. This was a monolithic, terrifying war machine. A 50-ton behemoth armed with a devastating 105mm main gun, the M60 was designed specifically to face down seemingly endless waves of Soviet armor across the Fulda Gap in West Germany. The M60 would quickly become the undisputed backbone of American and NATO armored forces for decades, and its creation relied almost entirely on the relentless, uninterrupted output of the Warren facility. But a hidden, insidious crisis was brewing beneath the soaring, soot-stained roof of Albert Kahn's architectural masterpiece. The Detroit Arsenal had been rapidly engineered and constructed in the frantic, freezing winter of 1940 for a very specific mid-century conflict. It was built to handle 30-ton Shermans, not 50-ton M60s. As the decades dragged on, the physical reality of the aging factory began to clash violently with the escalating demands of modern Cold War armor. The wear and tear on the facility was relentless, compounding, and inescapable. The massive concrete floors, poured in sub-zero temperatures during that desperate rush of 1940, began to crack, buckle, and spiderweb under the immense, crushing weight of the newer, heavier tank hulls. The colossal overhead cranes, originally calibrated for World War II armor plating, strained, groaned, and frequently broke down when tasked with lifting the massive, heavily armored cast steel turrets of the M60S. The electrical grids and hydraulic systems, designed for a simpler era of mechanical machining, were pushed to their absolute breaking points to power increasingly complex diagnostic and assembly equipment. The factory was essentially cannibalizing itself just to stay alive. Maintenance became a frantic, round-the-clock battle merely to keep the assembly lines inching forward. Chrysler management and their military overseers were locked in a constant, deeply frustrating struggle to retrofit a 1940s infrastructure for a 1960s and 70s reality. Every modification, every reinforced beam, and every upgraded crane was a costly, disruptive compromise that barely kept pace with the military's demands. Furthermore, the workforce was aging right alongside the building. The men and women who had built the first Shermans with youthful, patriotic zeal were now veterans of a grueling industrial campaign that had spanned over a quarter of a century. The air inside the plant was no longer charged with the desperate, unifying energy of a world war. Instead, it was thick with the chronic, grinding stress of a perpetual arms race. They were building weapons for a World War III that everyone prayed would never actually happen. The Detroit Arsenal was successfully holding the line against the Soviet threat, churning out the steel beasts that kept the Iron Curtain at bay. But the effort was exacting a devastating, invisible toll. The great industrial fortress was slowly but surely buckling under the weight of its own historical mandate. setting the stage for a technological crisis that its tired old walls would ultimately be unable to contain. The 1970s brought a cold, harsh reality check to the American military establishment. In October 1973, the Yom Kippur War erupted in the Middle East, serving as a brutal, real-world laboratory for modern armored warfare. American observers watched in stunned horror as hundreds of tanks, many of them American-built Pattons supplied to Allied forces, were decimated by a new generation of wire-guided anti-tank missiles. The era of simply bolting thicker slabs of steel onto a hull was over. Concurrently, intelligence reports from behind the Iron Curtain confirmed that the Soviet Union was fielding the T-72, a tank that was faster, lower, and armed with a devastating 125mm smoothbore gun. The M60 Patton, the aging champion of the Detroit arsenal, was suddenly looking dangerously vulnerable. America did not just need a new tank. It needed a quantum leap in military engineering. This desperate need birthed the M1 program, a hyper-ambitious project that would eventually evolve into the legendary M1 Abrams. In 1976, Chrysler Defense, the historic operator of the Detroit arsenal, won the fiercely contested contract to build this new mechanical titan. On paper, the Abrams was a masterpiece of lethal innovation. It was designed to be practically invulnerable to standard anti-tank munitions, utilizing a highly classified composite matrix known as Chobham armor, a complex sandwich of steel, ceramics, and other exotic materials. Instead of a traditional rumbling diesel engine, it would be powered by a Lycoming AGT-1500 gas turbine, essentially strapping a supersonic jet engine into a heavily armored box. It would feature advanced computerized fire control systems, laser rangefinders, and thermal imaging sights, allowing it to shoot on the move, at night with terrifying accuracy. The military was ecstatic. The Abrams was designed to be the undisputed king of the battlefield. But there was a glaring, insurmountable problem that no one in the Pentagon fully grasped: the Detroit Arsenal tank plant. The chosen birthplace of this futuristic marvel was an industrial dinosaur. When the blueprints for the M1 arrived at the Macomb County facility, the stark reality of the situation set in. Chrysler management was essentially being asked to build a state-of-the-art spaceship inside a 19th-century blacksmith's forge. The paradigm of mass production that had defined the arsenal for almost 4 decades, the brute force, Kintosenkino, de Vroeghausmalming, continuous flow assembly of heavy mechanical parts, was utterly incompatible with the surgical precision required by the Abrams. The factory had thrived on the rhythm of heavy welding, casting, and riveting. Now, it was being forced into the delicate business of microelectronics, advanced ceramics, and aerospace-grade engineering. The physical clash between the 1940s infrastructure and the 1980s technology was immediate and violently disruptive. The production of the M1 Abrams required an environment that the Detroit arsenal simply could not provide. The installation of the delicate, classified composite armor packages could not be done on a gritty, vibration-heavy assembly line. It required specialized handling, precise temperature controls, and near-clinical cleanliness. Yet the air inside the massive million-square-foot facility was permanently thick with the accumulated industrial soot, grease, and metallic dust of 40 years of continuous wartime manufacturing. The integration of the gas turbine engine was a logistical nightmare. The massive, aging overhead cranes, which had reliably hoisted solid cast-iron engines for decades, were ill-equipped for the millimeter-perfect alignments required to drop a complex, fragile jet turbine into a tank chassis without catastrophic damage. Furthermore, the Abrams was heavily reliant on miles of intricate wiring harnesses and sensitive computer modules. The brutal, heavy-handed assembly techniques of the past resulted in pinched wires, shattered sensors, and a cascade of electrical failures before the tanks even rolled off the line. This technological friction took a devastating toll on the workforce. The veteran steelworkers and mechanics of Detroit, men and women who could diagnose a faulty transmission by sound and weld a perfect seam blindfolded, were suddenly obsolete. They were being asked to operate like aerospace technicians and computer engineers. The transition was agonizing. Training programs lagged, frustration mounted, and the error rate skyrocketed. Quality control, previously a matter of checking for physical cracks in the steel, now involved agonizing hours of electronic diagnostics. Because the factory was fundamentally unsuited for the task, the production process slowed to an agonizing crawl. The vaunted continuous flow shattered into a series of bottlenecked, isolated workstations. As delays mounted, costs began to spiral violently out of control. The M1 Abrams was becoming the most expensive tank ever built, and a significant portion of that cost was being bled directly into the desperate, haphazard attempts to retrofit the decaying Warren facility to accommodate it. The Detroit Arsenal tank plant was no longer the undisputed master of its domain. It was a crumbling fortress drowning in the very complexity of the weapons it was ordered to create. The sheer burden of manufacturing the future had exposed the fatal fragility of the past. The system was fraying at the edges, and as the 1980s dawned, a catastrophic corporate earthquake was about to strike a blow from which the historic factory would never fully recover. The early 1980s did not just bring technological nightmares to the Detroit Arsenal, they brought a sudden, devastating corporate earthquake. For 40 years, the men and women of the Warren facility had operated under a unique, unspoken social contract. They were technically employees of the Chrysler Corporation, but in their hearts, they worked for the United States of America. They were the muscle of the military-industrial complex, the heirs to the arsenal of democracy. But in the brutal economic climate of the early 80s, loyalty and history were rapidly losing their value. The harsh truth was about to be revealed. The historic plant and everyone inside it was merely a piece on a much larger chessboard. The crisis did not originate on the factory floor, but in the corporate boardrooms of Highland Park. By 1979, the Chrysler Corporation was suffocating, battered by the energy crisis, fierce foreign competition, and years of internal mismanagement. The legendary automaker was on the verge of total bankruptcy. To survive, Chrysler's new chairman, Lee Iacocca, orchestrated a desperate, unprecedented bailout, securing $1.5 billion in loan guarantees from the federal government. But even with the bailout, the company needed a massive influx of immediate liquid cash to restructure its failing civilian automotive divisions. Iacocca looked across Chrysler's vast portfolio, searching for an asset to liquidate. The tragic irony was inescapable. The civilian car business was hemorrhaging money, but Chrysler Defense, the division operating the Detroit Arsenal and building the lucrative, heavily funded M1 Abrams, was highly profitable. It was the only jewel left in the crown, making it the only piece worth selling. In March 1982, the hammer fell. For the sum of $348.5 million, Chrysler sold its entire defense division to General Dynamics, a colossal aerospace and defense conglomerate. In an instant, the nameplates on the doors changed. The corporate letterheads were swapped out. But for the thousands of workers clocking in at the Warren plant, the shift was far more profound and deeply unsettling. When General Dynamics took the reins, the psychological atmosphere inside the Detroit Arsenal fundamentally fractured. Chrysler, for all its flaws, had been a Detroit company, a hometown employer intricately woven into the fabric of Michigan's working-class identity. Generations of families had walked through those same steel doors. General Dynamics, headquartered in St. Louis, was an entirely different beast. They were not an automaker struggling to build tanks. They were a dedicated, highly optimized defense contractor, and they operated with the cold, ruthless efficiency of a corporate machine, designed solely to maximize shareholder value and government margins. The new management immediately began auditing the aging facility with a hypercritical eye. The inefficiencies of the 1940s infrastructure, which Chrysler had tolerated out of habit and necessity, were now viewed strictly as unacceptable liabilities on a spreadsheet. The sprawling million-square-foot plant was expensive to heat, expensive to maintain, and fundamentally difficult to optimize for modern aerospace-grade manufacturing. More devastatingly, General Dynamics held a terrifying trump card. They did not just own the operations at the Detroit Arsenal, they also controlled the Lima Army Tank Plant in Ohio, a newer, much more efficient facility that was also churning out M1 Abrams tanks. Suddenly, the workers in Warren found themselves trapped in a manufactured, cutthroat rivalry. The corporate overlords actively pitted the two factories against each other in a relentless competition for production quotas and budget allocations. If the union in Detroit pushed too hard for wage increases or better working conditions, management would subtly, and sometimes overtly, threaten to shift more production volume to the Ohio plant. The workers, who had spent decades sacrificing their bodies to build the weapons that defended the nation, suddenly realized they were entirely expendable. They were no longer the indispensable heroes of the home front. They were just another line item, a variable cost that could be slashed or relocated if the quarterly earnings demanded it. This realization bred a deep, pervasive bitterness on the factory floor. The pride of craftsmanship was overshadowed by the looming dread of the next performance review or budget cut. The union leaders fought desperate battles to protect their ranks, leading to tense negotiations and strikes that further strained the relationship between the workforce and the distant corporate boardroom. The Detroit Arsenal tank plant was surviving, but its soul had been fatally compromised. It was churning out the most advanced armor the world had ever seen, yet the people building it had never felt more powerless. The invincible fortress was cracking from the inside out, hollowed by a new era where loyalty was a liability, and the bottom line dictated the future. They had survived world wars and global standoffs, but they were entirely unprepared for the sheer, clinical brutality of late 20th century corporate capitalism. The stage was set for a slow, agonizing slide into irrelevance. For nearly half a century, the men and women of the Detroit Arsenal tank plant had operated under a singular, unspoken assumption. The world was a dangerous place, and their labor was the only thing keeping the wolves at bay. Their entire economic ecosystem, their mortgages, their children's tuitions, and their civic pride were intrinsically tied to the geopolitical anxiety of the Cold War. But as the 1980s drew to a close, a seismic shift was rumbling across the globe, one that would bring unprecedented joy to millions and utter devastation to the working class of Warren, Michigan. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall, the physical and ideological manifestation of the conflict that had kept the arsenal's assembly lines moving for decades, was sledgehammered into dust. By the end of 1991, the Soviet Union itself, the great and terrifying adversary that had justified the creation of the M60 Patton and the mighty M1 Abrams, had officially collapsed. The Red Army was dissolving. The apocalyptic vision of thousands of Soviet tanks pouring through the Fulda Gap evaporated overnight. The world breathed a collective, monumental sigh of relief. The Cold War was over. The West had won. But inside the sprawling, soot-stained walls of the Detroit Arsenal, the news was received not with jubilation, but with a creeping, existential dread. The workers gathered around radios and small televisions on the factory floor, watching the celebrations in Red Square with a sinking feeling in their stomachs. They understood the brutal, uncompromising mathematics of their industry better than anyone. They knew the darkest, most carefully guarded secret of the military-industrial complex. Its ultimate success is also its executioner. The factory was a machine built to feed on global instability. It required tension, proxy wars, and the perpetual threat of annihilation to justify its massive operational budgets. Peace was a beautiful concept for humanity, but for a 113-acre complex dedicated solely to the mass production of heavy armor, peace was a death sentence. Without a monster lurking in the dark, there was no longer a need for the men who forged the swords. Almost immediately, the political winds in Washington shifted. Politicians who had spent their careers demanding massive increases in defense spending suddenly pivoted to demanding a peace dividend. The American public wanted the trillions of dollars previously funneled into the Pentagon reallocated to domestic infrastructure, education, and tax cuts. For the Department of Defense, this meant an immediate, aggressive slashing of procurement budgets. The sprawling, lucrative contracts for the M1 Abrams, the very lifeblood of the Warren facility, were drastically scaled back. The Pentagon no longer needed thousands of new tanks. They barely had the budget to maintain the ones they already owned. As the military orders plummeted, the corporate overlords at General Dynamics in St. Louis were faced with a ruthless logistical calculation. They were currently operating two massive tank production facilities, the historic Detroit Arsenal in Michigan and the newer Lima Army Tank Plant in Ohio. With the Cold War ended and contracts drying up rapidly, there was simply not enough production volume to justify keeping both factories open. One of them had to die so the other could survive. What followed was a grim, agonizing corporate Hunger Games. The workers of Detroit and Lima, all card-carrying union members who had dedicated their lives to the same patriotic mission, were deliberately pitted against each other in a desperate battle for survival. General Dynamics management effectively initiated a bidding war of concessions. Which workforce was willing to accept the deepest cuts to their benefits? Which plant could demonstrate the lowest overhead costs? Which facility could bleed the most to prove its value to the shareholders? For the Detroit Arsenal, the fight was lost before it even began. The workers in Warren fought valiantly, offering unprecedented union concessions in a desperate bid to save their livelihoods. But they were fighting against the insurmountable weight of their own history. The Lima plant in Ohio was a modern facility. It was physically smaller, highly optimized, cheaper to heat, and purpose-built for the complexities of late 20th century manufacturing. In stark contrast, the Detroit Arsenal was an aging million-square-foot leviathan. It was an architectural marvel of 1940, but a crippling liability in 1992. Its massive, uninsulated roof bled heating costs during the bitter Michigan winters. Its cracked foundations and antiquated power grids required constant, expensive maintenance. To the cold, dispassionate accountants reviewing the spreadsheets at General Dynamics and the Pentagon, the historical sentimentality of the arsenal of democracy meant absolutely nothing. The numbers simply did not add up. The realization swept through the Warren factory floor like a freezing wind. The workers, many of whom were second or third-generation tank builders, realized that no amount of hard work, no sacrifice in wages, and no appeal to patriotism could save them. They had built the weapons that defeated fascism. They had built the armor that outlasted communism. They had done everything their country had ever asked of them, with unwavering dedication and bone-crushing labor. And their reward for winning the greatest ideological conflict of the 20th century was to be discarded. The cruelest irony was undeniable. They had successfully built the tools that secured world peace, and in doing so, they had engineered their own obsolescence. The giant was no longer needed, and the long, painful process of shutting off its vital organs was about to begin. By 1995, the Detroit Arsenal tank plant was no longer a functioning engine of war. It was an industrial hospice. The grueling corporate Hunger Games between the Warren facility and the Lima Army tank plant had concluded, and the historic Michigan site had lost. The Department of Defense, guided by the Base Realignment and Closure (BRASE) Commission, handed down the final, irrevocable verdict. The sprawling complex that had practically birthed the modern American armored force was slated for complete and permanent shutdown. The transition from a bustling fortress of production to an empty shell was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, agonizing bleed that stretched over months. For the men and women still clocking in every morning, walking through the massive steel doors felt like visiting a dying relative. The workforce, which had once numbered in the thousands per shift, had been methodically gutted down to a skeletal crew. The few who remained were tasked with a deeply depressing objective. They were not there to ramp up production, but to manage the factory's deliberate, bureaucratic execution. They were fulfilling the very last remnants of the M1 Abrams contracts before the tooling, the technology, and their own livelihoods were boxed up and shipped south to Ohio. The psychological atmosphere on the factory floor was suffocating. There was no longer any union rallying cry or desperate hope for a last-minute government intervention. There was only the grim reality of the calendar. Most of the remaining workers were in their late 40s and 50s. They were men and women whose bodies had been permanently shaped by the grueling demands of heavy manufacturing, shoulders worn down by the constant vibration of pneumatic tools, hearing permanently dulled by decades of mechanical thunder. They were too young to draw a full pension, yet arguably too old, and too specialized to simply pivot to a new career in a rapidly digitizing economy. The social fabric of Macomb County, woven tightly over 50 years of shared shifts, bowling leagues, and union meetings, was actively unraveling right in front of them. Physically, the million-square-foot complex was dying section by section. As the final batch of tanks moved down the assembly line, the stations behind them were immediately powered down and gutted. The cavernous central aisle, once a chaotic artery of sparks, shouting foremen, and grinding gears, grew increasingly dark. The colossal overhead cranes, which had reliably hoisted 30-ton turrets through the air for half a century, were parked at the far ends of their rails and tagged out of service. Without the perpetual, bone-rattling vibration of thousands of machines running simultaneously, a strange, unnatural phenomenon occurred. The dust began to settle. For decades, the air inside the plant had been suspended, with a fine mist of metallic particles, welding smoke, and engine grease. Now, with the ventilation systems throttling back and the machines going cold, a thick layer of industrial grime began to blanket the empty workbenches and the cracked concrete floors. The silence creeping into the corners of the building was not peaceful. It was heavy, echoing, and profoundly unnatural. It was the sound of an empire giving up its ghost. August 1996 arrived with the suffocating humidity typical of a Michigan summer. But inside the Detroit Arsenal, the air felt utterly lifeless. The final days of operation were stripped of any corporate pageantry. There were no marching bands, no triumphant speeches from Washington generals, and no grand ceremonies to honor the millions of hours of human labor that had kept the free world armed. There was only the solemn, heartbreaking task of packing up history. The sensory details of those last shifts were etched permanently into the minds of the remaining crew. Across the vast floor, the sharp, metallic screech of heavy steel toolboxes being dragged across concrete echoed off the high glass-paned ceilings. Mechanics quietly wiped the grease from wrenches and micrometers that had been passed down from their fathers. Men who had spent 30 years standing at the exact same milling machines now spent their final hours unbolting them from the floor. preparing the heavy equipment to be auctioned off to the highest bidder or scrapped entirely. Then came the final machine. The last M1 Abrams tank moved down the shortened, skeletal assembly line. It was an excruciatingly slow progression. The workers did not rush. They lingered over every connection. Every weld was inspected with a reverent, almost religious focus. They tightened the final bolts with bare hands, running their calloused fingers over the cold, composite armor one last time. This wasn't just another vehicle. It was the physical culmination of 55 years of shared identity. When the tank reached the end of the line, the Lycoming gas turbine engine was engaged. The familiar, high-pitched whine of the jet turbine spooled up, vibrating the floorboards. The remaining workers instinctively formed a gauntlet along the central aisle. It was a silent, unprompted honor guard. As the massive desert-tan behemoth crawled forward, the human toll of the closure laid itself bare. Men with arms like tree trunks, veterans of brutal labor strikes and relentless production quotas, wept openly, wiping tears away with grease-stained rags. Others simply stared in furious, tight-lipped silence, glaring up at the empty management catwalks. They were mourning the death of their community, the erasure of their purpose, and the betrayal of a system they had served faithfully. The Abrams reached the massive, rusted steel doors at the front of the facility. The doors groaned open, flooding the dim factory with bright, blinding afternoon sunlight. The tank's treads clattered onto the exterior pavement, and then the engine was cut. Inside the plant, the foreman walked over to the main electrical breaker. With a heavy, echoing clack, the main power was thrown. The few remaining industrial lights flickered and died. The massive ventilation fans spun down to a halt. The heavy steel doors were pulled shut, and the heavy locking mechanism was thrown into place. And then it arrived. The absolute dead silence. It was a silence that had not existed on this plot of land since a frigid winter in 1940. It was not the silence of rest, but the profound, echoing emptiness of a tomb. The heart of the arsenal of democracy had stopped beating, leaving behind an empty shell of brick and glass, and thousands of displaced souls wondering what to do with the sudden, terrifying quiet of the rest of their lives. The immediate aftermath of the Detroit Arsenal's closure was not a sudden explosion of redevelopment, but a slow, haunting decay. For several years following the final lockout in the late summer of 1996, the 113-acre complex sat in a state of suspended animation. It was the corpse of a fallen titan, resting heavily on the soil of Macomb County. The soaring million-square-foot roof, designed by Albert Kahn, which had once sheltered a chaotic symphony of sparks and steel, now only amplified the sound of the wind rattling against thousands of grimy, steel-framed windows. Weeds began to push their way through the heavily reinforced concrete foundations, reclaiming the land with a slow, biological patience that the frantic wartime industrialists of 1940 could never have anticipated. Outside the chain-link perimeter fences, the city of Warren was reeling from the psychological and economic crater left behind. The factory had not merely been a place of employment, it had been the gravitational center of a vast working-class ecosystem. For generations, the rhythm of the city had been synchronized to the arsenal's shift whistles. Now the local diners that had served meatloaf and black coffee to exhausted welders at 3 a.m. sat completely empty. The corner taverns where fathers and sons had loudly argued over union politics and celebrated production quotas were unnervingly quiet. The human toll was immediate and profoundly disorienting. Thousands of highly skilled tradesmen and women found themselves cast adrift in an economic landscape that no longer valued their specific brand of heavy industrial alchemy. The transition was often marked by a bitter, dark humor, a necessary coping mechanism for a shattered reality. Men who possessed the arcane knowledge to seamlessly weld heavily sloped composite armor, or who could calibrate the firing sequence of a 120-millimeter smoothbore cannon with their eyes closed, were suddenly sitting in brightly lit, sterile community college annexes, clumsily learning how to format a basic resume on a desktop computer. The indignity of the situation weighed heavily. They were the architects of global peace, now reduced to entry-level applicants in a rapidly digitizing service economy that barely understood the magnitude of what they had once built. While the displaced workers navigated the labyrinth of unemployment offices and retraining programs, the fate of the colossal structure itself was being decided in municipal boardrooms. By the late 1990s, the United States government officially transferred the deed of the property to the city of Warren. Initially, there were faint, romantic hopes of preserving portions of the factory as a sprawling museum, a permanent, ironclad testament to the arsenal of democracy. But the brutal, uncompromising mathematics of urban development quickly crushed those dreams. The environmental remediation alone, scrubbing half a century of deep-seated industrial toxins, heavy metals, and spilled petroleum from the soil, was financially paralyzing. The Titan was simply too massive and too toxic to be kept as a souvenir. In 2001, the inevitable command was given. The wrecking balls and heavy excavators arrived, bringing an unceremonious end to the cathedral of industry. The dismantling of the fortress was a violent, methodical erasure of history. The thick steel girders that workers had braved sub-zero blizzards to bolt together in 1940 were effortlessly snapped by hydraulic shears. The massive concrete floors, poured extra thick to support the crushing weight of Patton and Abrams tanks, were jackhammered into a fine, gray dust that drifted over the city like volcanic ash. The colossal, soot-stained walls were pulled down, exposing the empty, cavernous interior to the Michigan sky for the first time in 60 years. The 113-acre parcel of land was aggressively subdivided, carved up into neat, commercially viable parcels by city planners eager to replace the lost tax revenue. The mythical landscape of wartime production was rapidly terraformed into the mundane architecture of 21st-century consumerism. Where the massive, rumbling assembly line had once dominated the space, churning out the mechanical beasts that liberated Europe and held the Iron Curtain at bay, a sprawling supermarket was erected. The precise geographic coordinates where Rosie the Riveter had welded Sherman tank hulls were paved over to create a vast, perfectly striped parking lot for a municipal community center. Retail strip malls, fast food drive-thrus, and manicured suburban landscaping swiftly blanketed the scarred earth. This was the ultimate jarring paradox of the Detroit Arsenal's legacy. The site that had quite literally forged the geopolitics of the 20th century was completely sanitized, transformed into a landscape of overwhelming suburban normalcy. There were no towering monuments to the deafening roar of the radial engines, nor to the thousands of calloused hands that had shaped the armor of the free world. The erasure was thorough and unapologetic. To a casual observer pulling into the supermarket parking lot on a Tuesday afternoon, there was absolutely no indication that they were parking their sedan on the very ground where an empire of steel had once risen, roared, and ultimately fallen. The fortress had been entirely dismantled, its iron bones traded for the quiet convenience of the modern age. When the dust finally settled over the leveled acreage in Macomb County, the true legacy of the Detroit Arsenal tank plant began to crystallize, revealing a profound and unsettling historical paradox. To understand the collapse of this magnificent industrial behemoth is to understand the inherent ruthlessness of the system it was built to protect. The factory was the ultimate manifestation of the GOCO model, government-owned, contractor-operated. Born from a desperate phone call between Washington and Detroit in the freezing winter of 1940, this model was hailed as an unparalleled triumph of American capitalism, It successfully merged the bottomless financial resources of the federal government with the ruthless, streamlined efficiency of the private automotive industry. It was the formula that won World War II and held the line through the darkest days of the Cold War. But looking back through the lens of history, that same brilliant synergy contained a fatal structural flaw. It inherently treated human loyalty and civic stability as disposable commodities. The men and women who clocked in at the arsenal were caught in a Faustian bargain. They gave their youth, their physical health, and their unwavering dedication to a mission of global survival, operating under the illusion that their government and their corporate employers recognized their humanity. In reality, the moment the geopolitical landscape shifted and the spreadsheets indicated a loss of profitability, the system dismantled them with the exact same clinical efficiency it used to build the M1 Abrams. The fall of the Detroit Arsenal was not an isolated tragedy. It was the harbinger of a much wider, more devastating phenomenon that would soon sweep across the American Midwest. The silent void left in Warren, Michigan, echoed through 1,000 other manufacturing towns. It became a defining chapter in the creation of the Rust Belt. The closure signaled the definitive end of the mid-20th century social contract, the promise that grueling, honest physical labor in service of the nation would guarantee a secure place in the middle class. When the heavy steel doors of the arsenal were locked for the last time, it proved that in the modern global economy, there were no sacred institutions. If the very forge of the arsenal of democracy could be casually discarded and paved over for a strip mall, no factory, no union, and no working-class community was safe. Yet there is a haunting asymmetry to the legacy of the Warren facility. While the million-square-foot factory has been thoroughly erased from the physical landscape, the mechanical beasts born within its walls stubbornly refuse to fade into history. The 44,000 tanks that rolled off the Detroit assembly lines over 5 decades were scattered across the globe, and they outlived their birthplace by generations. Heavily modified M48 Pattons and M60s still serve in the armored divisions of allied nations around the world. The M1 Abrams, the complex turbine-powered Titan that inadvertently broke the back of the 1940s infrastructure, remains the undisputed tip of the American military spear in the 21st century. The armor endures, but the hands that shaped it remain invisible. The sheer physical toll of the labor, the permanently damaged hearing, the scarred hands, the lung issues from decades of inhaling industrial dust, was borne quietly by the working-class families of Macomb County. They absorbed the shock of the factory's death, quietly retraining, relocating, or simply fading into early, underfunded retirements. Their profound sacrifice is largely absent from the official military histories, which prefer to focus on the generals who commanded the tanks rather than the civilians who bled to build them. Ultimately, the story of the Detroit Arsenal tank plant is a powerful meditation on the ephemeral nature of industrial glory. It asks a difficult question about what it means for a society to build its greatest, most awe-inspiring monuments solely for the purpose of human conflict. When the demand for destruction wanes, those monuments are unceremoniously torn down, leaving behind only echoes. Today, as shoppers push grocery carts across the exact geographic coordinates where thousands of workers once riveted the armor that saved the free world, the true legacy of the arsenal resides not in steel or concrete, but in the enduring, bitter lesson it taught. It stands as a silent reminder that empires are built on the backs of the many, but when the machinery stops, the architects of victory are almost always the first to be left behind in the dark. The story of the Detroit Arsenal tank plant is more than just a footnote in military history. It is a profound reflection on the expendable nature of human labor within the modern industrial complex. For over half a century, the men and women of Warren, Michigan, were told that they were the irreplaceable backbone of the free world. They poured their sweat, their youth, and their physical health into an endless river of steel, forging the very armor that defeated fascism and outlasted the Soviet Union. But the brutal reality of the system they served is that it possesses no memory and no inherent loyalty. The government-owned, contractor-operated model that birthed this miraculous facility was designed purely for efficiency, scale, and strategic dominance, not for gratitude. When the world no longer required 1,000 heavy tanks a month, the corporate and political architects of that system dismantled the fortress without hesitation. They erased a cathedral of industry, paving over 1 million square feet of working-class history to build supermarkets and parking lots, trading a legacy of global survival for the quiet convenience of suburban retail. The physical plant may be completely gone, but the invincible machines it birthed still roam the earth. And out there, beneath the manicured lawns and asphalt of Macomb County, the ghosts of the arsenal of democracy still linger. They serve as a quiet, unsettling reminder that while great empires rely entirely on the sacrifices of the working class to build their greatest triumphs, the arrival of peace rarely offers a dividend to those who actually forged the swords. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the rise and fall of one of America's greatest industrial titans. If this story resonated with you, please leave a comment below, sharing your thoughts on the legacy of these forgotten workers. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the abandoned monuments and hidden truths of our industrial history.